Hello everyone and welcome to another installment of the Soong Files, everything you never wanted to know about Star Trek. Today we're going to be continuing our Prime Directive theme that I did the last week's episode about the regular, standard, vanilla Prime Directive. Today we're going to be talking about the Temporal Prime Directive. The Temporal Prime Directive is a fundamental Starfleet principle that states Starfleet personnel are strictly forbidden from directly interfering with historical events and were required to maintain the timeline and prevent history from being altered. It also restricted people from telling too much about the future so as not to cause paradoxes or alter the timeline drastically. The first recorded regulation on file related to time travel was Starfleet's Regulation 157, Section 3, Paragraph 18, which stated, Starfleet officers were required to take all necessary precautions to minimize any participation in historical events. This very basic order was the building blocks for what would later become the Temporal Displacement Policy. The Temporal Displacement Policy was a new concept being taught at Starfleet Academy in the early 23rd century. This policy was a series of guidelines instituted by Starfleet which obligated its officers to take no action which could alter the course of history if they were to travel through time. The policy also specified that if a starship from the past were to encounter a starship from the future, they should maintain communications silence and reduce the view screen's resolution to its lowest point unless the future ship hailed them first. It's also stated that if the ship from the past was facing a situation in which it was not likely that it could be saved, then the starship from the future could take the crew of the past starship on board. This is consistent with the reaction of the alternate timeline USS Enterprise D crew in TNG's episode Yesterday's Enterprise, as they temporarily displaced USS Enterprise C crew was initially invited to rejoin Starfleet in 2366 rather than returning back through their time to near certain demise. The temporal displacement policy remained in effect for several decades until it received an overhaul sometime in the late 2380s. It is, however, unclear exactly when the Temporal Prime Directive came into effect, and if the policy was influenced in any way by time travelers themselves. The events of the Temporal Cold War suggest that the regulation had been rescinded, at least temporarily, by the 31st century. The Federation faction in the Temporal Cold War was dedicated primarily to keeping the timeline intact and preventing the other factions from interfering with it. It is reasonable to assume that with the destruction of the Sphere Builder's primary headquarters in the Alpha Quadrant and the rescue of the Nakul homeworld from the Tholians, that the Temporal Cold War ended and the directive was reinstated by the early 32nd century. The directive has been heavily featured in Star Trek Online. Serving as the backbone of their current expansion, Agents of Yesterday, the player works as a temporal agent jumping in and out of timelines to help protect the future. This gives Trek fans a first-hand experience in dealing with the Temporal Prime Directive violations and understanding that sometimes you cannot save everyone. The most notable violator of the Temporal Prime Directive is Admiral Kathryn Janeway. During their trip home, Voyager's violations of the Temporal Prime Directive were numerous, including some hotly debated ones, which included Janeway's allowing the Doctor character to retain the use of the mobile emitter despite it originating in the 29th century. Janeway is defending the decision by arguing that she wasn't prepared to deliberately handicap her chief medical officer in the name of an abstract rule. Although the Department of Temporal Investigations attempted to charge Janeway on multiple counts of temporal interference, they were advised to leave the issue alone by a representative from their own department's future who informed them that Admiral Janeway's actions actually preserved history, then changed it. So what do you guys think about the Temporal Prime Directive? Do you think that it's too complicated in order to actually apply a quote-unquote Prime Directive mentality to time travel? Or do you think like something that, you know, as complicated as time travel and as dangerous as time travel needs to be regulated? Or do you think time travel in this context of the Star Trek universe should even be allowed, knowing just how dangerous it can be going back in time and altering one thing could affect the outcome for billions and trillions of souls in the Alpha, Beta, and Delta quadrants. So I'm curious to see what you guys think. I appreciate you guys checking this video out. Please throw a like and a subscribe up on YouTube and follow me on Twitter at RealKetwolski. Live long and prosper, my Trekkies!